The story begins quietly, not with a loud event, but with something most people would have ignored. It started late one evening when an older radio engineer sat alone in his small workshop. He had spent years of his life listening to signals from the sky, not because anyone asked him to, but because it was something he truly enjoyed. Even after retirement, he kept his old equipment running, cleaning the dials, adjusting the antennas, and waiting for unusual sounds. Most nights, he only heard ordinary static, the kind that hums softly and never changes. But on this particular night, the static broke. At first, it sounded like a faint ripple, a small vibration that didn't match anything he had heard in years. It wasn't a voice, but it also wasn't random. He leaned closer to the speaker, holding his breath, and for a moment, he wondered if his equipment was failing. He checked the cables, the power supply, even the old amplifier he kept repairing with scraps. Everything was working fine. The strange sound remained, soft but persistent, moving up and down in a pattern. He recorded the signal and listened again. The more he heard it, the more he felt something familiar in it, almost like rhythm. Not the rhythm of music, but the rhythm of meaning. Signals like this didn't appear often. When they did, they usually turned out to be satellites or lost space probes. But something in his gut told him this was different. It sounded hesitant, almost tired, like something trying again and again to make itself heard. He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he replayed the recording and scribbled notes in his old notebook. By morning, his eyes were red and his hands hurt from writing, but he couldn't let it go. He decided to share the recording with a small group of people he trusted, mostly hobbyists and researchers he had met over the years. They were scattered across different towns and countries, but they all shared the same interest in unusual signals. When his friends listened to the recording, they didn't laugh or call it interference. They heard something too. Some said it reminded them of coded data. Others said it had emotional weight, like someone calling out softly again and again. One researcher slowed the signal down and noticed tiny changes repeating at regular intervals. These details could not appear by accident. They suggested intention. Began to spread quietly within the small community of signal analysts. Nobody wanted to draw public attention, because these things usually ended in disappointment. For decades, people had been searching for life beyond Earth, and almost every unusual signal eventually turned out to be natural noise. But this one felt different. Researchers who rarely agree on anything found themselves drawn together by curiosity. A few days later, one researcher compared weeks of recordings and found that the pattern repeated every 7 hours, almost perfectly. A natural source would not behave like that. It seemed like someone or something was sending the same message again and again. Maybe because they didn't know if anyone was hearing them, the group decided to contact several space agencies and observatories. They sent emails, files, charts, and hours of carefully studied audio. For a moment, they hoped for a serious response. Instead, the replies were dismissive. Some agencies said they were too busy working on current missions. Others said the signal was probably cosmic interference or a reflection from old satellites. A few did not respond at all. To the older engineer, this felt deeply frustrating. He had seen this happen before, how something unusual appeared, and the people with the biggest resources were too occupied with their own priorities to pay attention. He didn't blame them completely. Governments had tight budgets, strict rules, and long approval processes. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was being ignored, that he decided to keep listening every day. The more signals he collected, the more convinced he became that someone far away was asking for help. He didn't know who they were or where they lived, but he felt their message in his chest, like a quiet ache. It was as if the signal carried emotion, not just information. It didn't sound aggressive or threatening. Instead, It sounded weak, like something trying to reach out before fading away. The engineer wasn't the only one who felt this way. A few young scientists working in a private aerospace lab noticed the same pattern in deep space telemetry. They had access to large antennas and more advanced tools. After studying the data, they realized the signal didn't match any known spacecraft or planets. It was coming from a very distant region, one most people never looked at because it was dim, almost invisible, and not known to contain anything valuable. One scientist proposed plotting the origin of the signal over time. When they did, the result was surprising. The signal didn't drift randomly like natural cosmic noise. It came from a fixed point near a faded star system. This meant there was something there, something staying in one place, trying again and again to send out whatever message they had. The team grew more curious. They used long-range scans to examine the faint star system more closely. The images they received were blurry and incomplete, but clear enough to show something unusual. One of the small moons orbiting a dying star contained metallic debris on its surface. The shapes looked unnatural, like broken structures, shattered beams, and twisted frameworks. This wasn't a natural rock. Something had once been built there. The signal was coming from. Under the moon's surface dot, the discovery sent chills through the team. If something was underground, sending a repeating signal, it meant it was still functioning. Machines could last a long time, but not forever. The consistency of the message suggested that whatever was sending it was intentional and possibly alive. They discussed contacting world governments or major alliances, but the idea brought hesitation. Everyone knew how difficult official involvement could be. Big organizations often hesitated to act unless the situation promised strategic or financial value. A weak signal from a forgotten moon around a dying star didn't sound valuable to anyone. Besides, there was always fear of political consequences. If they discovered something intelligent, who would be responsible? Who would take the risk of approaching it? Who would take the blame if things went wrong? Eventually, the team sent their findings to a few government departments anyway, hoping someone would see the importance. Weeks passed with no response. They later learned that the reports had been quietly archived. The officials believed the signal wasn't dangerous, but also not important enough to spend resources on. Meanwhile, the older engineer and his small community continued collecting recordings. They noticed changes over time. The signal grew slightly weaker some days and stronger on others, almost like a heartbeat struggling to keep going. Sometimes the rhythm sped up, then slowed down dramatically, as if the sender was losing strength. This terrified the listeners, because it meant whatever was sending the signal wasn't a machine working perfectly. It was something fragile. Some nights, the engineer stared at the glowing radio dial and wondered what kind of beings were behind the signal. Were they like humans? Were they peaceful? Were they desperate? He imagined someone far away sitting in the dark, sending the same message again and again, hoping anyone would hear them. And civilization after civilization might have passed by without responding. The thought weighed on his heart. One evening, the engineer held a meeting with the small group of analysts through a video call. Everyone looked tired, but nobody wanted to stop working. They shared new data, updated charts, and new recordings. Slowly, a picture began to build in their minds. The signal wasn't just a simple call. It was a plea structured, repeated, and filled with a pattern that almost sounded like fear. The engineer looked at all the faces on the screen and said something that stayed with him for days. If we don't listen, maybe nobody will. Those words marked the beginning of a quiet determination. A few listeners began writing down their interpretations. Others started editing the recordings to make them clearer. A scientist with experience in acoustic analysis discovered a faint shift in tone, almost like two voices overlapping. This shocked everyone. It meant there could be more than one sender. The more evidence they gathered, the more certain they became that the signal was not random, not accidental, and not meaningless. It carried intention. It carried urgency. But still, the world remained unaware. The majority of people were busy with their daily lives, never knowing that a quiet cry from a distant moon was reaching Earth every 7 hours. Nobody knew that something abandoned, something lonely, something on the edge of survival was calling out through the darkness. Nobody knew yet that everything was about to change the moment humans decided to stop ignoring that call. The discovery of the faint signal was just the beginning. While most of the world remained unaware, a small private aerospace team had started to investigate more seriously. They weren't tied to any government or big organization. They had a simple goal: to find out what was sending the repeating call from deep space. They had bigger antennas, stronger scanners, and more resources than any hobbyist group. But what they didn't have was permission. No government wanted to give clearance for a mission to a dying star system that seemed useless. That didn't stop them. The team spent weeks studying the star system from afar. At first, all they saw was dust and darkness. The dying star barely gave off light, and the surrounding planets were small and unremarkable. But when they focused on the moon where the signal originated, they noticed something unusual. Unlike normal rock surfaces, it had shapes that didn't belong in nature. There were sharp edges, straight lines, and regular patterns that made no sense for a simple moon. It looked like ruins of something that had been built a long time ago, and then destroyed. This made the team both excited and uneasy. The signal was coming from under the surface, somewhere deep in the shadows. Whatever it was, it had survived for an unknown period of time. Machines alone could not survive indefinitely in such harsh conditions. And the pattern of the signal, repeating every 7 hours, suggested it was still being generated on purpose. The team began to run simulations. They tried to determine what kind of structure could exist beneath the moon. Their software suggested large underground chambers, carved or built with careful design. They imagined tunnels, halls, and rooms, all abandoned, but still functional in some mysterious way. The more they studied, the more convinced they became that the signal wasn't just a random transmission. It had life behind it. Something intelligent had created it, and it was still reaching out. They debated whether to contact the authorities. After all, most space agencies had dismissed the signal. But there were reasons not to wait. The moon was orbiting a dying star. Its energy would not last forever. If whatever was sending the signal depended on the star's heat or light in some way, every passing day increased the risk of losing it forever. They realized that waiting for permission might mean letting the chance vanish. So the team decided to act on their own. They carefully planned a mission with the resources they had. They could not send a full crewed spacecraft. Instead, they would send automated probes, first small, durable machines designed to dig and explore, to survive in extreme environments. These probes were equipped with cameras, sensors, and recording devices. Their task was simple: find the source of the signal and collect as much information as possible. The launch was tense. The small team worked in silence, checking every system over and over. Even minor mistakes could destroy the probe before it reached the moon. When the moment came, they watched the probe ascend into the sky, leaving a trail of light behind it. As it moved through space, the team monitored every heartbeat of its instruments, every fluctuation in its power. Hours passed like minutes, and each reading brought new excitement and worry. After several days, the probe reached the vicinity of the moon. Images began streaming back. At first, they were blurry, almost meaningless, showing only rocky surfaces and shadows. But slowly, shapes began to appear. Straight edges, dark cavities, and areas that looked carved by intelligent hands. The team realized the probe had found the entrance to an underground structure. It was partially buried, with debris scattered around it. The probe carefully hovered above the opening, scanning the area. The signals grew stronger now. The probe's sensors detected unusual energy patterns from below. They didn't match any known technology. It was not radiation, not heat, not sound in any conventional sense. It was something else, something deliberately structured. The team could only describe it as a language without words, a rhythm of pulses, vibrations, and light that carried meaning. They faced a choice. Should they dig deeper immediately, or return to Earth with their initial data? Returning would be safe, but they feared losing the opportunity to observe whatever was generating the signal. They decided to take a calculated risk. The probe deployed small digging instruments, designed to carefully remove debris without destroying potential evidence. Slowly, it cleared a narrow tunnel leading downward. Inside the tunnel, the readings were unlike anything the team had ever recorded. The air, if it could be called, that was strangely stable, despite being underground and far from a breathable atmosphere. Machines picked up faint vibrations that resembled movement. Something was alive. The probe's cameras were not designed to detect life, but even through grainy black and white images, the team saw shapes moving in the shadows. They realized that the signal was coming from living beings, not machines. They couldn't see them clearly, but the movement confirmed it. The beings were small, fragile, and careful. They did not flee or attack. They were observing the probe, just as the team was observing them. The situation was delicate. Any wrong move could harm these creatures or provoke them. The team sent the first communication to the probe, a simple attempt to send a recognizable pattern back. It wasn't language, but a repeating series of pulses that mirrored what the probe had received. They hoped to see a reaction. After hours, the readings changed slightly. The rhythm of the original signal shifted, faster, then slower, almost like a heartbeat responding. The team realized that contact had been made. The beings understood that someone was listening, excitement mixed with fear. The beings had been ignored for decades, perhaps centuries. Many civilizations had known about the star system and the moon, but none had intervened. Some might have thought the beings unimportant. Others might have feared political or economic consequences. The private team now faced a moral question. They were the first humans to actually respond. What did they owe these beings? How should they proceed safely without causing harm? The probe continued sending images. They were still blurry, but patterns began to emerge. The beings had structured small chambers, tools, and signs of attempts to survive. It was clear that the moon had once been a thriving place for these creatures. Something catastrophic had happened. Their world was destroyed or abandoned, leaving them struggling underground. The signal was not just a call for attention. It was a call for help. Late at night, one member of the team stayed behind in the control room, staring at the screens. They realized something that no report could explain fully. This was more than science. This was human responsibility. The beings were alive, alone, and reaching out for connection. Every delay could cost them. For the first time, they felt the weight of being witnesses to life that no one else seemed to care about. The probe continued its work, mapping tunnels and chambers. The beings observed cautiously, never aggressive, just curious. Over time, small gestures could be detected. Objects moved in ways that seemed intentional, changes in their signals that suggested recognition or understanding. The team documented everything, knowing that these moments would be critical if they ever wanted to interact directly. Meanwhile, news of the private mission began to leak quietly among scientific communities. There were debates. Should private individuals interfere in unknown systems? What if the beings were dangerous? What if contacting them violated interstellar rules? Yet, within the team, there was no question. They had found living creatures, abandoned and forgotten, calling out in the dark. Ignoring them was no longer an option. The days turned into weeks, and the probe's discoveries painted a clearer picture. The beings were small, delicate, and clearly intelligent. Their technology was simple compared to humans, but it was clever, adaptive, and focused on survival. They had built shelters, energy sources, and communication devices, all underground. They had survived alone for years, possibly generations, using the limited resources available. One night, the team recorded something unexpected. The signal from the beings changed dramatically. It became more urgent, faster, and stronger. They were aware now that someone was listening, and it seemed they were asking for more than attention. They were asking for help. The team realized that the situation had moved from observation to moral responsibility. They could not remain distant. If humans did nothing, these beings might not survive much longer. At that moment, everyone in the team understood something profound. This wasn't just about discovery or exploration. It was about compassion, responsibility, and choice. For decades, these beings had been abandoned by every civilization that passed through. Now, for the first time, humans had the chance to respond, not as rulers, not as conquerors, but as helpers. The private teams stayed awake that night, watching the signal pulse in front of them. They knew that the next step would be dangerous, uncertain, and full of questions with no immediate answers. But they also knew it was necessary. For the first time in generations, someone had reached out and listened. And for the beings underground, that alone might change everything. The private aerospace team knew that sending probes could only go so far. Machines could gather information, map tunnels, and detect energy patterns, but they could not truly understand or interact with the beings sending the signals. The next step was dangerous, uncertain, and filled with risk. They needed humans on site, humans who could respond with care, empathy, and caution. After careful planning, they selected a small crew of volunteers. None were soldiers. None were explorers seeking glory. They were scientists, engineers, and medics, people who understood risk, but also understood the importance of human responsibility. They spent weeks training in simulated underground conditions, learning to move slowly, avoid noise, and handle fragile environments. Every decision mattered because they were about to enter a world that no human had ever seen up close. The journey to the dying star system was long. Days passed as the crew monitored instruments, reviewed mission plans, and mentally prepared themselves. Nobody spoke much about what they expected to see. The silence was heavy, but not tense. Everyone carried the same unspoken thought. These were intelligent beings who had survived alone for years, and humans were now their first contact. How would they react? Would they be afraid? Curious? Aggressive? When they finally arrived near the moon, the first sight of the surface was both beautiful and haunting. Jagged rocks glowed faintly under the dying star's light, casting long shadows across the terrain. The entrance to the underground chambers was barely visible, a dark gap among broken structures. It looked fragile, as if a single mistake could collapse the passage. The crew landed carefully, moving with precision, and began setting up equipment to secure their descent. The first steps into the tunnel were quiet. Each member held a light, scanning the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Dust hung in the air, and every sound echoed, making the crew painfully aware of how delicate the environment was. They could feel the history around them, the weight of abandonment, and the faint energy of the beings who had called out to them through the signal. After several meters, they saw movement. Small shapes shifted in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the lights. The crew froze, holding their breath. The beings were observing, cautious, and clearly aware of the humans. The first impression was not fear, but careful curiosity. They did not flee. They did not attack. They simply watched, The team realized that any sudden action could be disastrous. They decided to communicate slowly, gently. They activated small devices that could emit light pulses and soft vibrations, mirroring the patterns of the signal the beings had been sending. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the movement of the beings shifted. They began responding, adjusting the rhythm of their own signals to match the humans' attempts. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Contact had been made. The first true view of the beings left the crew in awe. They were small, frail, and delicate, yet intelligent. Their bodies were unlike anything humans had seen before. They moved carefully, using every gesture with purpose. Their eyes, if they could be called that, glimmered with awareness, reflecting a mixture of fear, curiosity, and cautious hope. The team understood immediately. These beings had survived in isolation, abandoned by every civilization that had encountered them. Now, for the first time, someone had arrived who intended to help rather than exploit or ignore them. The crew spent hours observing before attempting closer interaction. They carried instruments to measure air quality, energy levels, and environmental stability. They left small supplies of nutrients and water-like solutions where the beings could access them safely. They moved slowly, speaking in calm, steady tones, though they were unsure if the beings could understand sound at all. Every gesture was deliberate. No sudden movement, no loud noise, no hint of aggression. Over the next few days, the crew learned more about the underground environment. The beings had built small chambers using fragments of metal and stone. They had created energy sources that hummed faintly, enough to power basic functions. Tools were carefully arranged, indicating a culture of organization and cooperation. Despite the destruction around them, these creatures had maintained some semblance of civilization, adapting to the harsh conditions and making survival possible. The humans realized that they had stumbled upon a tragedy of neglect. The beings had been ignored for decades. Every other civilization had known about them, yet no one had intervened. The abandoned race had survived on minimal resources, relying on ingenuity and each other. They were not weak or helpless. They were intelligent and resilient, but isolation had left them vulnerable. The humans felt a deep responsibility. They were not explorers seeking fame. They were witnesses, and perhaps for the first time, they could be helpers. One evening, the crew made their first deliberate attempt to interact closely. They placed a small platform with food, water, and simple tools in the open chamber. Then they stepped back and waited. The beings approached cautiously, inspecting the supplies. Some touched the items with careful fingers. Others hesitated, studying the humans' presence. Slowly, they began to accept what was offered. The humans observed silently, taking detailed notes, but never rushing. Every moment was precious. During this time, the humans noticed something remarkable. The beings were trying to communicate. They moved objects in patterns, created small signals of light, and used vibrations in the ground. It was not a spoken language, but it was intentional. The humans began to mimic these patterns, establishing a primitive form of dialogue. Hours turned into days as the exchange grew. Each side learned to anticipate the other, to respond with patience and understanding. Through these interactions, the humans began to understand the being's history. Though incomplete, the evidence suggested a world once vibrant and thriving. Their civilization had been disrupted by some catastrophe, a war, a collapse, or natural disaster. Survivors had retreated underground, preserving what they could. The signal that had reached humans was not a random noise. It was a plea, repeated across decades, hoping that someone would finally respond. The emotional weight of this realization was immense. The crew had been trained to be objective, scientific, and cautious, but they could not ignore the humanity in the situation. These were sentient beings who had endured isolation and danger for decades, relying on ingenuity and perseverance. And now, After all that time, humans had arrived not as conquerors or scientists, but as listeners and helpers. The crew established routines. Each day, they interacted with the beings, leaving supplies, recording signals, and observing behavior. They documented environmental conditions, repaired damaged technology, and explored deeper tunnels to map the underground network. Slowly, trust began to build. The beings became less fearful, approaching humans with curiosity instead of hesitation. Gestures became more confident, signals more deliberate. Communication, though primitive, was real and mutual. One moment stood out above all others. A small group of beings moved toward a human crew member who had carefully placed a device replicating their signal patterns. The beings adjusted the device themselves, making subtle changes. It was as if they were teaching humans their language. The human responded by mirroring the changes. For the first time, a true exchange of understanding occurred. Both sides recognized each other as intelligent and intentional. As days passed, the team realized that their mission had shifted. What had begun as observation had become rescue, and perhaps even partnership. They were not only witnessing history, they were shaping it. The beings were alive, intelligent, and capable of cooperation, but they were fragile and alone. The humans had a choice: leave and report findings, or stay and protect them, offering the first real help they had received in generations. By the end of the first week, it was clear that humans could make a tangible difference. The beings had begun responding more confidently to signals. Small improvements were evident in their environment: repaired shelters, reorganized spaces, and increased activity. It was not much, but it was a start. The humans understood that survival was no longer just a matter of enduring. It was a matter of hope. That the experience changed the crew in ways they could not have imagined. Scientific curiosity remained, but it was now mixed with empathy and moral responsibility. They understood that exploration alone was not enough. The beings were alive, aware, and deserving of dignity. Ignoring them was no longer an option. Humanity had arrived, and with it came the first chance to rewrite decades of neglect. The first contact ended not with ceremony or fanfare, but with quiet acknowledgement. The beings withdrew to rest, signals slowing but not stopping. The humans retreated to their temporary station, reviewing recordings and planning next steps. Both sides had learned something crucial. Understanding, patience, and careful action were more powerful than force or speed. For the first time in generations, the abandoned beings had hope, and the humans had a purpose beyond exploration. They had become guardians, witnesses, and friends. After the first contact with the abandoned beings, the human crew began to explore more deeply not just the tunnels, but the history of the place and the reasons why these creatures had been left alone for so long. While the beings themselves could not explain in words what had happened, the humans relied on technology, observation, and old records to piece together the story. The underground chambers were filled with remnants of the past. Broken tools, faded markings on walls, and worn structures hinted at a once thriving civilization. Some symbols suggested trade, community, and cooperation, while others reflected fear, urgency, and attempts to survive disasters. The humans could feel the echoes of generations who had endured struggle and abandonment. Every artifact told a story, even if it could not speak in words. Using long-range scanners, the team detected old data storage devices embedded in the walls. Strange metal objects with circuits that seemed almost organic. Carefully, they extracted one and connected it to their system. The files contained logs from long before. Beings had gone underground. The records showed that the moon had been inhabited by a small, intelligent species, living in a delicate balance with their environment. They were peaceful, creative, and focused on survival, science, and cooperation rather than war. The humans were shocked to learn that this Civilization had been discovered repeatedly by outsiders over the years. Different civilizations, far larger and more advanced, had visited the moon, observed the beings, and then left without intervening. Some considered them primitive or unimportant. Others feared the political consequences of helping. In the galactic community, every action could have wide-ranging effects, and apparently, no civilization wanted to take responsibility for a small, isolated race. Some records revealed that expeditions had even studied the beings in secret. Advanced sensors had mapped their tunnels, tested their technology, and assessed their capabilities. Notes indicated curiosity and admiration in some cases, but no civilization had provided aid. The beings were observed, analyzed, and then abandoned to continue surviving alone. The humans reading these logs felt a growing sense of anger and responsibility. Generations of neglect had nearly destroyed a fragile civilization. Interviews with archived explorers, recorded in holographic logs, painted a clearer picture. Some admitted that they had deliberately avoided contact. They had been instructed to observe but not interfere. Others admitted fear that helping could lead to unwanted political complications, economic burdens, or conflicts. One entry described a teen leaving the moon, acknowledging that the beings were intelligent, but not worth the risk. The humans could hardly believe what they were reading. Despite this long history of neglect, the beings themselves had survived. They had adapted to underground life, using ingenuity and cooperation. They had built small energy sources, shelters, and rudimentary communication devices. They had survived storms, structural collapses, and scarcity of resources. They had endured isolation that lasted for decades, possibly centuries. And through it all, they had kept sending signals, hoping someone would finally respond. The humans realized that their arrival was not just a scientific milestone, it was a moral responsibility. They were the first to respond to the cries that had gone unheard for generations. The beings were fragile, intelligent, and resilient, but they could not survive indefinitely without help. And yet, the humans also understood that intervening would not be simple. Every step had to be careful, deliberate, and respectful of the being's autonomy. While exploring, the humans began to notice traces of previous visitors' mistakes. Some structures had been damaged by probes left behind. Some tunnels had been weakened by drilling and testing. Equipment from past expeditions had been discarded in corners, forgotten and ignored. It was a haunting reminder of how little others had cared. These remnants were a warning. Even good intentions could have unintended consequences. The team documented everything. They recorded how the beings had rebuilt around old debris, how they had adapted broken technology, and how they had maintained a fragile sense of community despite years of neglect. The humans began to understand that survival was not just about food and water. It was about hope, cooperation, and trust. These beings had kept all three alive, even when the universe had turned away from them. The moral weight of the situation was heavy. Some members of the crew struggled with frustration and guilt, not for themselves, but for humanity as a whole. How many civilizations had passed this way, ignoring signals that could have saved lives? How many had considered the beings unworthy of attention? And now humans had arrived. Would they act with compassion or simply observe and leave? One night, the team gathered to discuss the next steps. They reviewed every recording, every scan, and every artifact. The consensus was clear. They could not leave. They had an opportunity to protect, nurture, and restore life that had been ignored for far too long. But they also knew it would not be easy. Resources were limited, and the beings were delicate. Every decision could have consequences. They had to plan carefully, balancing action with patience. As the humans prepared, they noticed another remarkable thing. The beings were starting to communicate more deliberately. Using gestures, vibrations, and symbols, they seemed to explain their history, their needs, and their culture. The humans could not understand every detail, but they could sense the meaning. The beings had endured loss, abandonment, and fear, yet they had not given up. The resilience of these creatures was inspiring and heartbreaking at the same time. The humans also realized that the beings had their own sense of pride and autonomy. They were not helpless. They had survived without aid for generations, and any attempt to rescue them had to respect that independence. The team decided to approach slowly, offering help only where it was needed, observing without imposing, and listening carefully to any response. Trust, they knew, could not be demanded. It had to be earned. The humans continued to study the old records, piecing together the timeline of neglect. They discovered that the first abandoned signals had been sent decades ago, perhaps longer. Multiple civilizations had encountered them, assessed them, and turned away. Some records were vague, censored, or incomplete, as if the visitors had wanted to forget they had ever seen the beings at all. The humans felt the enormity of what had been missed lives ignored, struggles unseen, and calls unanswered. The crew also began documenting the beings' ingenuity. Despite the lack of outside help, they had maintained energy, built tools, and preserved their social structure. They had adapted in ways that no human could have predicted. The humans felt admiration for their resilience and sadness for their isolation. For generations, these beings had faced the universe alone, and now humanity had the chance to change. The experience had a profound effect on the humans themselves. Scientific curiosity was replaced with moral awareness. Observation alone was no longer enough. The beings were alive, intelligent, and capable of teaching humans about resilience, cooperation, and survival under impossible circumstances. And yet, the humans were acutely aware that every move mattered. One wrong step could destroy the fragile balance that had kept these creatures alive for so long. The team began developing a plan to provide sustained support. They could not bring large supplies immediately, and they could not interfere with the beings' natural adaptation. But they could offer technology, nutrition, and protection in small, carefully managed doses. They could teach the beings how to repair structures, stabilize energy sources, and manage underground hazards. Every action had to be collaborative, respectful, and guided by the beings themselves. The humans also discussed sharing the story with the wider world. They understood that revealing the neglect of previous civilizations would be controversial. Some would criticize them for intervening. Others would question the ethics of contact. But they knew it was important to show that life, no matter how small, fragile, or abandoned, deserved recognition, care, and protection. The story of neglect had to be known, not to blame, but to remind others of responsibility. Over time, the humans and the beings developed a rhythm of cooperation. Humans provided guidance and resources, while the beings shared knowledge of the tunnels, energy systems, and survival strategies. Slowly, trust deepened. The beings were no longer only cautious observers. They were active participants, shaping the ways in which help was provided. Communication improved, and small breakthroughs in understanding created hope that had been absent for generations. In the quiet moments, the humans reflected on what they had discovered. The beings had endured decades of abandonment, yet they had survived. Their resilience, intelligence, and careful cooperation had kept them alive. And now, humans had arrived not as judges, scientists, or conquerors, but as allies. For the first time, the abandoned beings had someone willing to listen, care, and act on their behalf. By the end of this phase of exploration, it was clear that history had been cruel and neglectful. Every civilization that had ignored the beings had contributed to their suffering. But humans had the chance to break the pattern, to show that attention, empathy, and careful action could save lives that others had abandoned. The team knew that the next steps would be crucial. They were no longer merely observers. They were protectors, witnesses, and participants in a story of survival, hope, and responsibility. After weeks of observation, study, and careful planning, the human team realized it was time to do more than just watch. The beings had survived for decades without help, but they were fragile. Their energy systems were unstable, their shelters were weak, and their supplies were almost exhausted. The humans knew that their arrival was not just a scientific mission. It was a chance to save a civilization that had been abandoned for far too long. They could no longer remain distant observers. The first step was bringing supplies. The team had brought with them small containers of nutrient-rich substances, water-like solutions, and basic medical equipment. They left these carefully at the edges of the underground chambers, making sure the beings could access them safely. The beings approached cautiously, moving slowly as if afraid the humans were intruders. But once they understood that the humans meant no harm, their hesitation faded. They began using the supplies, testing, and exploring them. It was the first real relief they had felt in decades. The humans were careful not to overwhelm the beings. They knew that sudden changes could be dangerous. The team spent time explaining, in gestures and symbols, how the supplies worked, how to handle the water devices, and how to use the nutrient containers. Slowly, trust grew. The beings learned to accept help while still maintaining control over their environment. The humans observed, documented, and adjusted their approach based on the reactions of the beings. Medical attention was another priority. Some of the beings were weak, with visible signs of long-term malnutrition or injury. The humans worked quietly, using small tools to stabilize energy levels, administer nutrients, and clean minor wounds. Nothing was forced. Everything was voluntary. The beings allowed help where it was needed, and gradually, their strength returned. Even small improvements were cause for celebration among the humans. Every stronger movement, every clearer signal was proof that the mission mattered. Alongside supplies and care, the humans also began repairing the underground structures. Some tunnels were at risk of collapse, and energy systems had degraded over decades. Using portable tools and careful guidance, the humans helped reinforce tunnels, stabilize weak areas, and repair damaged energy conduits. They were careful to let the beings participate in every step. This was not a takeover. It was a collaboration. The beings were intelligent, capable, and proud of what they had survived on their own. The humans respected that communication improved daily. At first, it was gestures, vibrations, and pulses of light. Slowly, the humans learned to interpret some of the symbols, and the beings began understanding patterns in the humans' efforts. This allowed them to coordinate work more efficiently. They could indicate which areas needed repair, which supplies were most useful, and even suggest small improvements. The humans were surprised by the beings' creativity and ingenuity, despite their fragile condition. Over time, the humans and the beings began to share more than just tools and supplies. They shared knowledge. The beings showed how they had survived using minimal resources, how they had created energy from limited materials, and how they had organized their community underground. The humans, in turn, offered ideas for more stable energy systems, improved shelter designs, and ways to store food and water more safely. Each side learned from the other. Collaboration became the foundation of hope. The emotional aspect of this work was profound. Humans, who were used to being in control, found themselves humbled. They saw creatures smaller, weaker, and isolated for generations, yet intelligent, patient, and resilient. The beings had survived in a world that had ignored them, without guidance, without allies, and without hope for recognition. The humans realized the responsibility they carried. Their presence could save lives, but it could also disrupt fragile systems if not handled carefully. Every action had to be thoughtful. As the days passed, small celebrations began to emerge. A being repaired a section of tunnel without guidance, and the humans applauded with gentle gestures. Another being used a human device in a clever way the team had not anticipated, demonstrating adaptability and intelligence. Moments like these reinforced the importance of patience, empathy, and respect. The humans learned to watch, wait, and support rather than rush, and the beings responded with trust and curiosity. Nutrition continued to be a focus. The humans introduced new nutrient sources, carefully monitoring the beings' reactions. They experimented slowly, one being at a time, ensuring that no one was overwhelmed. The beings learned quickly, showing remarkable understanding and careful handling of the new supplies. The humans documented everything, noting which solutions worked best, which devices were easiest to use, and which areas needed more attention. This careful observation allowed them to plan larger-scale support in the future. Safety was another concern. Some tunnels were unstable, and the underground network was vast. The humans had to map everything carefully, marking dangerous areas and reinforcing weak points. They also monitored the beings' movements, ensuring that no one ventured into high-risk zones alone. Over time, the beings seemed to understand the importance of safety, avoiding dangerous areas, and helping guide the humans through complex passages. Cooperation became a true partnership. Over weeks, the beings grew stronger. Signals became more confident, movements more purposeful, and interactions more complex. The humans realized that the beings were not only surviving, they were beginning to thrive. Every improvement in health, energy, or shelter was proof that human care could have a tangible impact. The mission was no longer just about observation. It was about restoration, recovery, and hope. One particularly remarkable moment came when a small group of beings worked alongside the humans to repair a collapsed tunnel. They communicated through a series of vibrations and gestures, coordinating efforts with precision. The humans were amazed at the beings' intelligence and adaptability. The collaboration showed that even creatures who had been abandoned could teach humans about ingenuity, resilience, and cooperation. The humans also worked on communication systems. They installed devices that could transmit signals more clearly, allowing both humans and beings to exchange information faster. This reduced confusion, allowed coordination of tasks, and helped build trust. For the first time, both sides could share ideas, plans, and observations in real time. The beings seemed to understand the purpose immediately, and they began experimenting with the new devices themselves. Hope became a shared feeling. The humans realized that they were not just helping beings survive, they were helping a civilization reclaim dignity. The beings had endured abandonment, neglect, and isolation for decades, yet they had never given up. Now, humans were their allies, their protectors, and witnesses to their survival. Small gestures, a repaired shelter, a nutritious meal, a stabilized energy system were proof that compassion could change lives. The team also faced ethical questions. How much should they intervene? Could they teach the beings too much too fast, disrupting their natural adaptation? Should they leave certain aspects untouched to preserve autonomy? These were difficult questions, but the team approached every decision with care. They listened to the beings' responses, observed reactions, and adjusted their actions accordingly. Respect and empathy guided every step. Over time, the humans began documenting not only the beings' survival strategies, but also their culture. They observed how the beings organized themselves, how they cooperated, and how they communicated emotions through gestures and vibrations. Even in isolation, the beings had maintained social bonds, problem-solving skills, and a sense of community. Humans realized that these traits had been key to survival and would continue to be essential as support increased. Every small improvement reinforced the human team's belief in their mission. The beings were no longer just survivors. They were participants in their own recovery. The humans were facilitators, helping restore stability, security, and hope. The fragile signal that had first reached Earth had grown into a vibrant interaction, a story of cooperation that spanned species and civilizations. By the end of the first major phase of intervention, several significant accomplishments were visible. Energy systems had stabilized, shelters were reinforced, and nutrition and medical support were effective. The beings had learned new methods to manage resources and were beginning to experiment on their own. Communication had improved, trust had deepened, and both sides understood that this was only the beginning of a long journey toward full recovery. The humans reflected on the experience. They had arrived as observers, guided by curiosity. They had found beings abandoned by history, alone in a dangerous environment. Through patience, empathy, and careful action, they had begun to restore life, health, and hope. Every success, no matter how small, was a victory not only for the beings, but also for humanity's sense of responsibility. The story of this intervention was far from over. The humans knew that more challenges lay ahead: relocation, long-term care, and protection from potential threats. But for now, the immediate needs were met. The beings were healthier, more confident, and engaged in collaboration. Hope had returned to a civilization that had not known it for generations. Humanity had finally answered the call, not with force, but with care, patience, and understanding. After weeks of careful intervention, the humans and the beings had reached a turning point. What had begun as observation, then small acts of help, had grown into a steady partnership. The beings were no longer fragile survivors. They were learning, adapting, and beginning to thrive in ways that seemed almost impossible given the decades of isolation they had endured. The humans knew that this was the most critical moment. They had to ensure the next steps preserved trust, autonomy, and safety. The first major project was establishing a stable living environment. Some of the deeper tunnels had been unsafe, and the outer chambers were exposed to occasional collapses and debris. The humans, working alongside the beings, reinforced walls, repaired shelters, and installed simple but reliable energy systems. These systems were powered by local resources and designed to be maintained by the beings themselves. The humans taught them the basics, but never imposed control. Everything was collaborative. As they worked, small rituals developed. The beings would signal completion of a task with vibrations or light patterns, and the humans responded with gentle gestures or a series of soft pulses. These simple acknowledgments became a form of communication, a way to express gratitude, understanding, and connection. The human crew observed how meaningful these interactions were. Even without words, they could feel the bonds forming between species, a silent trust that had taken decades to build. Nutrition and health continued to improve. The humans had introduced sustainable supplies, teaching the beings how to manage nutrients and water efficiently. Over time, the beings experimented with their own methods, blending old survival techniques with new tools. Weak individuals regained strength, and small families began to thrive in the safer tunnels. The humans felt a profound sense of fulfillment. They were witnessing life returning where it had once been at the edge of extinction. Communication deepened as well. The beings had begun experimenting with the new devices humans had introduced. Patterns of light, vibration, and movement became more sophisticated, and the humans learned to respond with more complex signals. Over time, the two groups developed a rudimentary language. Though still primitive, it allowed them to convey ideas, warnings, gratitude, and even curiosity. Moments that had once seemed impossible were now part of daily life underground. One day, a group of beings led the humans to a previously unexplored chamber. It was larger than any tunnel they had seen, and filled with what seemed like remnants of a central meeting space. Here, the beings began to demonstrate something extraordinary: an organized system of charts, signals, and even small machines that had survived the years of abandonment. The humans realized that the beings had been trying to preserve knowledge and culture all along, even in isolation. Their resilience had a depth that was humbling. The humans began documenting every detail. They scanned walls, mapped the tunnels, and recorded signals. Every artifact, every movement, every new idea from the beings was carefully preserved. This was not just about survival. It was about history, culture, and dignity. The humans realized that they were becoming more than helpers. They were witnesses to the recovery of an entire civilization, a race that had been abandoned by every other known society. Over time, trust grew to the point where the beings no longer hesitated when humans approached. They would come to meet them, exploring new tools, experimenting with devices, and even showing signs of curiosity about the humans themselves. It was clear that the beings had begun to see the humans as allies rather than strangers. The first contact had evolved into friendship. This emotional bond became the foundation for further growth. The humans also began training some of the beings in basic repair and maintenance skills. They taught them how to stabilize energy systems, reinforce tunnels, and maintain clean water and nutrient supplies. The beings learned quickly, showing intelligence and creativity beyond what the humans had anticipated. In some cases, the beings improved upon the techniques taught to them, adapting tools in ways that the humans had not imagined. It was a true collaboration, built on mutual respect. Emotional growth was as important as physical recovery. The humans noticed that the beings were showing signs of happiness and security. They moved confidently through the tunnels, engaged in playful interactions, and expressed curiosity about their environment. Small celebrations emerged: a repaired chamber, a successful experiment, or a clear signal between humans and beings became moments of shared joy. The humans realized that these creatures had survived not only physically but emotionally, maintaining hope and resilience despite decades of neglect. The next challenge was ensuring long-term survival. The humans began to establish systems for sustainable resource management. They helped the beings plan food and water storage, energy conservation, and structural maintenance. These systems were designed to be simple enough for the beings to manage independently, but effective enough to provide stability for generations to come. The humans knew that true rescue was not just about immediate relief. It was about teaching survival, adaptation, and foresight. One evening, the team gathered in the largest chamber. The beings formed a semicircle, sending signals in a pattern that the humans had learned to interpret as an expression of collective gratitude. The humans responded with carefully timed pulses and gestures, acknowledging their understanding and respect. For the first time, a sense of closure emerged. Decades of abandonment, neglect, and struggle had led to this moment of mutual recognition and hope. As the weeks passed, small improvements multiplied. Shelters were stronger, tunnels were safer, and energy systems were stable. The beings were healthier, more confident, and engaged in more complex tasks. The humans observed subtle signs of cultural revival, patterns of play, experimentation with tools, and small communal gatherings. The underground world, once quiet and fragile, was now alive with activity and purpose. The humans also reflected on the broader implications of their work. They had learned that survival depended not only on technology, but on empathy, patience, and understanding. Ignoring a civilization for decades could have devastating consequences, while careful, compassionate intervention could save lives and restore dignity. They realized that the story of these beings was not only about survival, it was about the moral responsibility of any civilization that discovers life. No matter how small or isolated. One particularly moving moment came when a group of beings brought the humans to a chamber that had been preserved as a sort of memorial. Symbols and carvings depicted ancestors, events, and knowledge that had been kept alive through generations. The humans were humbled. These beings had survived not only physical hardship, but the emotional burden of isolation, keeping memory and culture alive despite the lack of recognition or aid. The team began planning for future generations. They understood that long-term survival required more than humans' immediate presence. They created devices and systems that could continue to support the beings without constant supervision. Education, sustainable technology, and communication systems were designed so that the beings could maintain independence while still benefiting from the knowledge and help provided. The humans had become teachers, protectors, and partners, preparing the beings for a future free from abandonment. By the end of their mission, a remarkable transformation had taken place. The underground chambers, once dark and fragile, were now a thriving community. The beings moved confidently, communicated efficiently, and managed their resources effectively. The humans had not only provided help, they had fostered trust, respect, and hope. The beings were no longer simply survivors. They were a restored civilization with the ability to flourish in the years to come. The humans reflected on the journey. They had answered a call that no one else had heard or acted upon. They had found life abandoned, alone, and at the edge of extinction. Through patience, empathy, and careful action, they had not only preserved life, they had restored dignity, hope, and culture. The experience changed the humans themselves, reminding them that compassion and responsibility were as important as curiosity and exploration. As the humans prepared to leave, they assured that the beings would continue to thrive independently. Supplies were left in manageable quantities, systems were stabilized, and communication channels were maintained. The humans said goodbye with gentle gestures and signals, knowing that the beings now had the knowledge and tools to care for themselves. There was no fear, no panic, only mutual understanding, and the quiet confidence that life would continue. The final signal they received before departure was clear and unmistakable. It was not just a message of thanks, it was a message of hope. The beings had survived abandonment, endured isolation, and learned resilience. Now, with humans' intervention, they had a future. For the first time in generations, their lives were not defined by neglect, but by possibility. As the humans departed, they looked back at the moon one last time. Shadows of tunnels, flickering lights from energy systems, and signs of life filled the underground world. They knew that this story would not end here. The beings had been given a second chance, a chance to thrive, grow, and continue their civilization. And humanity had learned a lesson that would echo far beyond a single star system. Life, wherever it exists, deserves attention, care, and compassion. For the beings, it was the beginning of a new chapter. For humanity, it was a reminder of responsibility, empathy, and the power of answering a call that had been ignored for generations. Hope, fragile and quiet at first, had now become a force strong enough to shape the future. The once abandoned alien race was no longer alone, and their story would continue with light, life, and possibility.